So Classic Cataclysm is coming to WoW, and there's even some reason to believe that we are going to be seeing Classic Mists of Pandaria, which would have been thought of as a joke back in the day when Classic was initially announced. And this begs the question, what exactly is Classic WoW? I think many people have been into the idea of Classic WoW when playing the earlier iterations of WoW, and also Season of Discovery just recently. For many WoW players, we kind of prefer Classic, but defining what Classic WoW is becoming increasingly hard to define. So I'm going to get into it. What exactly is Classic World of Warcraft? Before we get into it, if you want to get a sick in-game leveling guide, you can get Zygor guides by clicking the link in the description below and use code VOLTY to get 20% off. Considering this is a referral link, it gives me a kickback, so I appreciate any support you give me in that regard. So thank you to anybody that uses that link. Now, I think the first thing to distinguish in defining what Classic WoW is the idea of what the actual gameplay experience is and game mechanics. Because in World of Warcraft, as we know, just because something is in the game mechanics doesn't mean that it is going to be the same experience playing it back. Just the general praxis of playing classic World of Warcraft in 2024 to what it was in 2004 to 2006 era vanilla WoW, it's night and day. There is just such a big difference in how the games are played, even if the gameplay mechanics are by and large the same. And to drive this point home, imagine if Blizzard announced that they will be creating fresh vanilla servers, but this time they would be going patch by patch as it was from 2004 to 2006. We know that the gameplay experience of playing on those servers would not be anywhere near as it is today. There's just been so much shit that has changed since the mid-2000s. There's parsing culture, there's like very sophisticated add-ons, there's a general understanding and development of skill that players have. Even things like internet connections, people have much more stable internet connections compared to what it was. Social media, that in itself changes the way that World of Warcraft is played. WoW as it was in the vanilla days was a lot more social than it is now, and I think technology and people growing older and all of these factors that are outside of the game mechanics themselves, I think really does change the way that the game is played. If you're trying to recreate the feeling that you had playing WoW for the first time when you were like 20 years younger, I don't think you're going to get that experience again. So because of that, people create new challenges for themselves. We see this with the parsing culture and people speedrunning raids in Classic WoW to absurdly fast times. People are creating their own new challenges. And this happens in other games as well. This isn't unique to WoW. I went down a Pokemon rabbit hole and I noticed that people were creating these absurd challenges to beat Pokemon in ever increasingly crazy ways, just to give themselves that feeling of challenge that they would have had when they were a child and their brain obviously wasn't as developed as it is now. Yeah, I think that's kind of what's going on with WoW. What exactly is the point of beating Molten Core in like 10 minutes? There isn't. It's just a self-imposed challenge. So I think that classic feeling is almost impossible to get back. I think we did see a bit of that in Season of Discovery Classic WoW to like a small extent, where people were figuring out new things and discussing things on trade channels. And I think Season of Discovery Phase 1, I think people will have a bit of nostalgia for it. Like, it was a good time. So there's this whole idea of things outside of the game that changes what exactly Classic is. But then there's the gameplay mechanics themselves. And I think if we're being intellectually honest, I don't think we can say Classic WoW is as binary as that wording would suggest. I think you have to kind of see Classic WoW on a spectrum between something that is like vanilla WoW as it was and also retail WoW today. There's been a lot of significant changes to the gameplay that I think could define what Classic WoW is. And it's not just one thing, there's a bunch of things going on that have changed over the years in WoW. A big factor into this Classic WoW spectrum is the quality of life. In vanilla WoW and TBC, it kind of feels like there's like zero hand-holding. There's so many things you need to micromanage and do yourself. Like just getting to like a dungeon portal, you have to like get flight masters, go on boats, and travel to the place unless you have a warlock that can summon you. And even then, you need multiple people to summon a player to that dungeon instance. The necessity to buy ammo and general quality of life for WoW players has just gone up and up each expansion. I think in Wrath of the Lich King, that's when things really did shift in this regard, where you have like the random dungeon finder. Now you instantly get teleported to a dungeon with strangers and you don't need to do any work to find them. You just click a button, wait, and go into the place and get your loot and get out. And even things like raid size, as we went from Vanilla WoW to TBC, we saw the max raid size go down from 40 players, which is a big headache to get that many people in one place at one time. It's just like a upward trajectory or quality of life to the point in retail WoW where it just feels like the world is just making life easy for you. Like the world is kind of revolving around you to make your gameplay experience as smooth as possible. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to your own personal preference, but I don't think we can deny that a low quality of life, as cynical as that sounds, is a big factor as to what makes Classic WoW classic. And in Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm, and onwards, I think that's when quality of life really started to increase. And obviously in the more recent expansions, it got even further beyond that. Another big thing is class balance. So Blizzard has gotten a lot better at balancing the classes in WoW. I think it's just kind of undeniable. If you compare class balance to what it was in Vanilla WoW to Retail WoW, it's just not even close. In Vanilla WoW, there were just some classes that could just do things other classes simply couldn't do. Mages AoE farming is a great example of that. Warriors being the only viable tank in a raiding scenario for the most part. And if we're talking about parsing and speedrunning culture, you would stack as many DPS warriors as possible. Like, it's actually kind of hilarious at how strong Fury warriors were. And I think with each new expansion going into TBC and Wrath and so on, they really did make an effort to make all of the classes and specs more viable and competitive to varying degrees, but I think it's undeniable that class balance has improved with expansion after expansion. I have no idea what Dragonflight is like when it comes to class balance, but I'm pretty sure the gap between the top DPS and the bottom DPS is going to be a fraction of what it was in Vanilla WoW. Like, imagine comparing a Fury Warrior DPS to a Smite Priest. There's just like a gulf in power, right? And even in Season of Discovery, there's quite a big gap in terms of power levels for the various specs and classes. So in that regard, Season of Discovery is actually quite faithful to the idea of Vanilla or Classic WoW. Another thing to consider on the Classic WoW spectrum is itemization. Now, similar to class balance and spec balance, I think Blizzard has gotten a lot better at balancing items. After each expansion, it felt more and more that the items that you were getting and the equipment that you were equipping were becoming basic stat sticks. And it could be summed up in basically item level. The idea of the average item level defining your character is actually quite valid, because all the items are pretty much stat sticks anyway. On the other hand, when you look at the earlier expansions of World of Warcraft, in particular Vanilla and TBC, there were some items that legitimately couldn't be defined by item level because they were so unique. A good example of this was the Wolf's Head Helm. This was an item that I believe was best in slot for Feral DPS druids. From Vanilla WoW all the way up to Wrath of the Lich King, I believe. I've never played a Feral DPS, but I know that helmet, the unique effect that it has where it grants you energy going into cat form, it would enable a totally new playstyle for Feral DPS and make it viable, called power shifting. You would go in and out of cat form, regenerate energy, and it really did complete the Feral DPS spec. The helmet was that good, no matter how strong the stats on an item were, it didn't replace the unique effect that item had. That is probably the most extreme example of this. There were other items that you could get in Vanilla WoW that were quite low level relative to other things you could get that were absurdly strong for the unique effect that it had. A good example is Hand of Justice, which was a trinket that was mid-50s, Yet for most of vanilla WoW, a melee DPS would equip this because a 2% chance of getting an extra hit is just that good at that time. And I think as expansions went on, the itemization became a lot more smoothed out, where items could basically be summed up in item level. And this became more and more of a factor the closer we get to retail WoW as we know it. I think Season of Discovery is actually doing a pretty good job of making the items quite unique in that regard. There's quite a lot of interesting effects that items have that aren't just boring stat sticks, and I think that's pretty cool, where item level doesn't tell you the full story. The equipment and new items you get in retail WoW becomes very much forgettable, like you don't really remember the name of the item you're getting even. If I ask you to name an item from each expansion, I'm sure you're going to have many examples from Vanilla WoW, TBC, Wrath, and it gets a bit harder in Cataclysm, the Mists of Pandaria, and so on. I think part of the reason for that, the items slowly became simply stat sticks, as opposed to items that are genuinely unique. So saying all that, beyond all of this, there was also the vibes and art style. And this is something that is quite subjective and hard to define, but I think if you just simply look at what WoW and Warcraft looked like back in the day and compare it to what it looks like now, I think it's undeniable that there's been a significant change in art style. There's been quite a lot said about the writing and the way lore is delivered in retail WoW now. It definitely feels quite different to how it was back in the day. Like, if you just look at a cutscene from retail WoW and look at a cutscene from Warcraft 3 or early WoW, it's just so different, where all the faces on the characters are very expressionate and they talk about their feelings a lot. And that wasn't really the vibe that we had in early Warcraft. And like I've been saying, this is a spectrum. I think this shifted more and more to this direction as expansions have went on. I mean, just look at the character model of the Worgen. Like, look at its face. Like, it's just become so different. It just looks different. Like, obviously this Worgen looks a lot less intimidating compared to the vanilla WoW model, but like the retail WoW model just looks, I mean, it just looks a lot more softer. It's undeniable that there has been a change in the vibes. Early Warcraft was definitely more gritty in its art style and way the story was presented. And I think Blizzard kind of got that with Season of Discovery. I think they were pretty faithful to the overall vibes of vanilla WoW. I think Season of Discovery is actually pretty fantastic in that regard. It does feel like you're playing an expanded version of vanilla WoW. And in this spectrum, considering all of these factors, you can rank which version of WoW ranks where on the classic spectrum. You may prefer World of Warcraft to be a bit closer to retail or a bit closer to classic, somewhere in between. It really comes down to what your personal preference is. I think Wrath of the Lich King is when you saw that first big shift into like the retail WoW model where a lot of those gameplay mechanics were introduced. And for many people, this is their sweet spot. It really is a spectrum. And where you think the best version of WoW is up to you.